Walter Weg.
And where were you born?
I was born in Leipzig, Germany.
Um, can you tell us something about your family?
My family has been German for some generations. They thought of themselves as German, Jewish, yes, but German primarily. And they had been in that part of Leipzig for some time. My father before, my father's father and my mother's family. We were sort of middle-income Jewish family, quite well established. I was the oldest of three siblings, and we grew up closely associated with three cousins who lived only 2 streets away. We all lived in flats, which was a common thing in those days. Our flat was 3 floors up, no lift. We had a little balcony. From the balcony we could look over a tennis court, which used to be flooded in the winter for ice rink. We also used to go swimming locally, and we went to the cinema, and we went for walks in the woods, and we enjoyed the common things that people do, middle-income families do. We had lots of Jewish friends, but also non-Jewish friends, and we got on very well with all our neighbours, and were in a Jewish, when we were very small, we were all in a Jewish nursery, kindergarten, which was arranged by the various Jewish families, including our cousins, which was held in different people's homes. Now that was before 1933, and I remember it well. We even had holidays abroad. My earliest recollections were when I was about 4, and my sister was just a year or so younger than myself. Our third sibling, sister, was born 6 years after my sister, so she was a great deal younger than us. Likewise, our cousins were similarly intervals. So my eldest cousin was just a year older than myself, so she was at school, local school, before I went to school. I went to school at the age of 6, so born in 1928. It was actually in the spring of 35 by the time I went to school, which meant born in November 1928, so I was quite old. I'd already pestered my mother about reading, so I tried to read little notices and things. So when I got to school, we quickly learned to read and write. In my first year, everything was fine, but in my second year, things were not so good.
Remind me, what year would that be?
Now, in 1935 was my first year, 1935 to 36, and in that year also, my sister went to the Jewish school. She didn't go to the local school because we had already had problems with people foul-mouthing us in the street right from 1934, and even when we were still going, it was quite common for our mother to send us shopping to the corner shops, and we would often be disadvantaged because they knew we were Jewish. It became more and more obvious that the Jewish children were not regarded as being as queues weren't formed in those days, it was more difficult for a Jewish child to get served in a shop.
So out of the blue, these people that you had got on with well suddenly changed their attitude.
Yes, maybe partly because they had to show that they also towed the line, but we're not quite sure. It was quite obvious that when things got really bad, some people really were stuck their necks out to help us, whereas others were too afraid or didn't wish to.
So would you say that that was the first time you realised that there was such a thing as anti-Jewish feeling?
Yes, we noticed it quite quickly. I did, and even at the age of 4 or 5, I knew I was regarded as a less important being than the others. But my first year at school was fine. It was only in the second year at school that one teacher started the process of disadvantaging me. For instance, she would deliberately not give me the necessary equipment to deal with the lesson, and then point me out in front of all the others, and I was the only Jewish boy in the class. It was boys only. We were boys and girls' school was separate in that school. And I was pointed out to the others and then given a slap and made to stand in the corner. This became my normal treatment, although I didn't find that very pleasant. Most of the others didn't seem to worry too much, and I was still friends. But it was getting more difficult to go to the cinema. Most shops had on them Juden unerwünscht, which meant that Jews were not welcome. Even so, some did serve us when I was with adults. But it was becoming more difficult daily as things went on. We were not allowed to keep a Jewish, other than a Jewish person in the household. My parents both working. My father had a book publishing business which he shared with his 2 elder brothers, and my mother used to go and help in the office. So we had a lady looking after us at home when my mother was out. But it became impossible to have non-Jewish. They had to be Jewish, and then it became more difficult to do various things. We weren't allowed to go to the cinema. We found that after being rather jeered at on the ice rink, they no longer allowed us to hire the skates. So my grandmother kindly gave us for the next Hanukkah a pair of skates each. So, but we only skated for a short time before they said we should not come at all.
Can you tell me, is it what they said, were the notices up, say, nicht für Juden or Juden nicht erlaubt?
Juden unerwünscht was normally put there, but I couldn't say for now, at this moment, whether at the ice rink it was so. They made it so clear that we were unwelcome, although we were regular customers.
And the cinema?
We weren't allowed to go at all. This was
so there would be a sign, or was it something you gathered?
I never went again after I was told don't go. And we always only went with adults in those days.
So who said don't go? The cinema?
No, my uncle used to often take us, said we can't go anymore. We can't go to the theatre. We could still go to the museums, and he took us to museums. And but that seemed to fade out also. I I don't remember going after about 37, 38. We were rather restricted in entertainment, but we always made our own. There was no TV in those days, and the phone was a dial phone, and the fridge was a block of ice that was brought by horse and cart, and the coalman came and bought a sack of coal, and it had to be delivered into the cellar, and all kinds of things like that. Of modern technology, it did not exist, but we made our own entertainment. We were much more adept at doing that, but it became less allowed for Jews to assemble, which meant that at parties we used to come in 2 by 2, so that it didn't look as if there was a larger party in any one place. Our neighbours were always very good to us, but we had to take down, my parents had to take down the notices which said beggars or something, not welcome. And when I came back from school, I suddenly realized that the house plates outside had changed, and I was wondering whether I was going to the right one, but it was. All kinds of changes were happening all the time with enormous rapidity. We used to go skiing to a little place not far from Leipzig, and there the three of us with my mother were not allowed to dine with the other guests in the bed and breakfast place because we were Jewish. Although the owner was under pressure not to have Jews there at all, she still kept having us. And we went skiing, which was nice. And that was at the age of 5, 6. And when it became impossible to have holidays as a family, the former nursery school, the kindergarten mistress, who had now become the wife of the doctor, the local doctor, took about six to 10 of us to week our fur on one of the islands off the North Atlantic coast there, and even out there we found that we had to walk all along the beach before there was a beach not reserved only for non-Jewish people. But as a result, we passed by all the wonderful sandcastles that everybody had made and admired them all before we went to our little part of the beach, which was virtually empty.
Did the teacher, nursery school teacher who took you, was she Jewish?
Yes. And the doctor was also Jewish. But shortly after that, he had to go because he no longer could practice, and they made great difficulties for him. Things became more difficult all round. My cousins and I, we all then had to transfer to the Jewish school. But the day I did was after a traumatic experience for me. My friends with whom I used to go home, which is only a short walk from the local school, started throwing stones at me rather sort of playfully at first, and so I threw a few back. That was all right, and then we got into the main road, the bridge over the railway sidings, when a passing policeman egged on the common passers-by to do the same, to throw stones at me. And so some of the older youngsters did, and things became very unequal. And I found myself running quickly away from the scene. Fortunately, nobody followed me. When I got home, my parents said, you can't go to that school anymore. Tomorrow morning, my father took me to the Jewish school, where already my cousin and my sister had been going for some time. But the school became so crowded that we had to have two sessions. We were divided into morning session or later morning session. So some of us had to start at 7 and others about 10 or between 9 and 10, which made it difficult for us, but that's how it had to be. The Jewish school was quite a way away from us. We lived in a rather normal southern part of Leipzig, whereas the north-western corner of Leipzig was the more the Jewish area, where some of our relatives lived, but most of them lived nearer us. It meant then that we had to take two trams, one tram to and then change to another tram. So it was in 1938 in November that I was on this early shift when there was an unusual amount of police and fire service activity, and we could see smoke, and one adult passenger across the way from me spoke to another one and said, you know, it's the Jews, they had it coming to them. So I didn't quite understand at first, but it became clear to me when I saw a warehouse, a store, which we knew to be where we often shopped because it was a Jewish store of clothing, where my mother usually took us to get our clothes and shoes and things. That was on fire. But I got on the next tram and got off at the area where I normally walked around to the next road where the school was round the corner, and on the normally clean pavement in those days, the pavements were quite clean, well kept. There was a lot of glass. I couldn't quite understand where this glass came from, but it seemed to come from the upper floors of the buildings I was walking along. And then I turned the corner, and there, to my horror, was half the road was strewn with half-burnt books from the school, littered down the steps into the road, and there was nobody else around. And I just stood there in front of the steps, wondering what to do, when suddenly a tall youngster appeared at my side and said, "No school today, little one," to me.
Was that a Jewish boy?
I don't actually know, but I don't know at all. I just said thank you and quickly walked back. I thought I wouldn't walk the same way as I'd come because of all the glass, but it was worse the other way because it was past some shops, Jewish shops, and they were daubed with swastikas and the glass broken and the contents strewn, and I saw adults picking their way across the debris and looking with amazement at what was going on.
Can you put a year to this?
This was November 1938, November the 9th, 1938.
So that was the famous Kristallnacht.
Afterwards we were told that's what it was, but I quickly tried to get back to catch the tram, and there, coming off the tram my sister was just coming off the tram to go to school, and I quickly took her. And we went home. I didn't say anything, and my sister was asking me, why do you take me? And I didn't want to speak because the rather fairly empty tram going back, people could overhear and may even turn us off, and we wouldn't be able to get home on the tram. So I didn't say anything until we got home. And when we got home, my mother had already been informed of what had been going on overnight. We hadn't known, although there was the telephone, nobody dared phone to tell us. So most of the other children never even tried to go to school. The school didn't close then, and I never went to school again. But in the early spring, it was reopened for a short time. So my sister went back to it. But by that time, I was already on the way to England.
So that means about 4 months or so, or 3 months, none of you could go to school.
That's right. And what happened then, one of the teachers offered to teach us English. What I should say is that this Kristallnacht wasn't just the burning of buildings. They were rounding up Jews everywhere. And when we got home on our third floor flat, we could see the police rounding up men in the neighborhood and take them away in vans. My father was at work in his office, and he came home in the evening. It wasn't until 3 days later, at 5 o'clock in the morning, that we had a knock on the door with a young Nazi SS man and another chap in uniform, saying that my father must come quick, not to take anything. Now it was very cold towards the middle of November in Leipzig at that time, but my mother quickly got the warmest things she could and even packed some sandwiches in his pocket for him to go. But I remember I was looking, opening the door to our room and seeing the proceedings in the hall, and my sisters were both crying.
Would you say, I mean, looking back on it, the boys that came to round your father up were children practically?
Well, to me he was an adult, but he was a very young adult.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it was characteristic that they might only be 16 or so.
I'm afraid I wasn't able to judge, but it may well be true.
I mean, in retrospect.
Yes. I mean, I can picture his face now. I would say that maybe 16 to 20, between 16 and 18. Not a proper adult.
But the thing is that nobody would have dared not to do what they were told.
I'm afraid that was so. It was a sort of culture in Germany, actually. Authority was the law. Unfortunately, authority was making new laws every day, and it became very difficult. But that's what people did. They did not readily flout the law.
I don't think it even occurred to people, almost.
No.
Maybe.
Well, we children were certainly trained to follow authority. The teachers held sway in school. There was never any ill disobedience. That's right. We all had to behave as well as we could. We did get corporal punishment, and nothing desperate, but severe enough to imply that we had transgressed. And of course, sometimes we didn't know what we had. Just being Jewish was enough. And on that, before that day, known as Kristallnacht, my uncle had already moved to Holland in order to try and get his family to move out of Germany. I remember when my grandmother always had the family in on Sundays. It used to be alternate Sundays for the adults with us children, and the other Sunday used to be just children in the afternoon. On one of the days when all the family was there, and my uncle was announced to everybody else within hearing of us as children, "We shall be safe in Holland. The Dutch will flood the dikes." And I was thinking to myself, well, what about aeroplanes? Aeroplanes were existing in those days, although not as common as they are now, and people used to still go by sea when they travelled, except a few. So he did go to Holland, and immediately after Kristallnacht he had my cousins and my aunt follow him to Holland. So they disappeared immediately after Kristallnacht, but we didn't see them again. But they settled in Holland, and he moved part of his firm, which and joined with somebody else to do the fine photographic business for which he was quite renowned in Leipzig.
When you say you never saw him again, ever?
Not until we moved out of Germany ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's another story, because what happened then, my mother, my father in concentration camp, my uncles all in concentration camps, different concentration camps. The next thing that happened is that one of my father's brothers, my elder brother, his eldest brother, had appendicitis in the camp. There was absolutely no cover, medical cover, and he died in agony quite soon after they were put in the concentration camp. And it cast a nasty shadow over everything, because he wasn't that old. My mother then thought, what shall we do? We can't get out. Let's send the children. Now, first thing I thought, well, let's send our eldest, which is me. And they had the idea that a businessman from England, an English businessman, who used to help in the uncle's firm, which was where my grandmother was also active, ever since her inventor husband, my grandfather, had died. This businessman agreed to take me with him when he went back to London. So that's exactly what he did. My first attempt to be there, I remember my mother taking me to Berlin, and something was not in order, so we had to come home again. The next time it was my father who came out of concentration camp, thanks to my mother. What had happened was that it had been rumoured that certain certificates which the men might have had from service to the country in the past were a pass for them to be taken out of concentration camp. So my mother went to my father's mother, who was very elderly, couldn't really cope with all this, and she found the certificates for my uncles, and as well as my father, and also she went to the Gestapo headquarters in Leipzig, and this was a very brave thing to do for a woman. My mother wasn't very old, she was only born in 08, so she was only 30 years old. The first thing she said when she arrived there was she saw one woman being thrown down the stairs. So my mother, however, has a very polite way with her.
The Gestapo headquarters.
Yes, and she was brave and actually managed to get the certificates. It was too late for my uncle who died.
Gestapo headquarters.
Yes, and she was brave and actually managed to get the certificates. It was too late for my uncle who died of appendicitis, but she managed to get my father out. This was actually very late in December.
Which camp was he in?
My father was in Sachsenhausen, and others were in Buchenwald. They were all in different camps. My father said that when he came back from Sachsenhausen, his head had been shaved, and he looked, and his clothes were all loose on him because he really, I hardly recognized him when he came home. We were absolutely shocked, and he had to, he was actually took to his bed for a few days before he could really take part in normal life again. When he was on the train home, people actually allowed him to sit down. So the normal folk knew what was going on, and they understood, and they even had a heart.
Some of them.
Some, yes, some indeed. Yes, the next thing was, of course, I went then to England. We were lucky because my grandmother, being an excellent and far-sighted employer, used to look after her employees. That is the same firm as my uncle, and used to provide all equipment for any newborn baby, and look after those who became ill. Very far-sighted, and they, in their turn, when they managed to get out, they would do something for her. And one of these people found a place for me through the Bloomsbury House in a boarding school. So I had a place to go to. I was first of all taken by this English businessman overnight. It was about January 8th, 9th. It was a fearsome gale, and I was terribly sick on board. I wasn't actually in the same cabin as this Englishman, but I remember being very, very ill indeed. And in the morning I was told I would look very green. But this Englishman managed to haul me onto the train and deliver me to my to another aunt, a great aunt, who
a great aunt of yours?
In my mother's family.
Mm-hmm.
And she had 3 grown-up children, and in a flat in Highgate, and I slept on the floor behind the door in the same room as my second cousin, who was about 18, very, very grown up. He then, yes, for a few days, my aunt looked after me until I went to the boarding school, and then I was at least. This boarding school, Mr. Maltby was the headmaster. He offered a place for a Jewish boy for 4 years, and although the war came, which he hadn't considered, he kept his promise, and I was there for 4 years. During that time, we had to be evacuated from Hastings, where the school was, to Devon, with all the complications that involved. But all of these were paid.
And the only person of your family you would be in touch with would be the aunt?
Yes, but in this boarding school, it was we wrote letters every Sunday. I wrote a letter every Sunday to my parents, and all these letters were monitored, of course. My first Sunday, I was taken to a church, as everybody goes to church, and as I had said in the scripture lesson, I'm Jewish, which rather silenced the whole class. The headmaster's wife got a nun to talk to me in good German, and she was most kind. And my father had written to me that during difficult times he had also gone to church, and he found it a rewarding experience. And I would think so in years to come. It doesn't mean that I have to change my religion. And so it proved. So I went to school, and I was even in the choir. And I must say, all my schoolmates were very good to me. At no time in that school was I ever pilloried for being a Jew, despite the fact that in the first Easter, when I knew enough English to understand the sermon, it was a most hideous sermon, making it quite clear that our Lord was murdered by the Jews. None of the children afterwards mentioned it at all to me, although I remember the sermon very well.
You might have been the only one who listened.
I don't think so. Anyway, I tried to study English very hard and spoke nothing but English. They were very good to me, and it was a very easy way of learning English very well at the age of 10. But I then discovered I couldn't even speak German very well. Only my letters home in German was the only time I exercised my German. The teacher of our class in the Karlbach-Schule, Jewish Karlbach-Schule in Leipzig, made it her business to come and seek me out in Hastings, which was fantastic of her. This was Fräulein Schüler was her name. She later became Mrs. Caroline Yarn, who married a mathematics professor in Southampton. And I went to see her in the year 2001.
Oh, very recently. Well, relatively.
Something like that. And unfortunately, she met an accident soon after that and died. I'm very pleased to have been to see her. And she had loads of pictures and information of her years at the Karlbach-Schule. And there was even one in which I think I was in, and certainly my one in which my sister was in.
So the Karlbach-Schule in Leipzig?
Yes,
Yes. Goodness,
that's right. And she had emigrated to England, and then married this Southampton professor. Um,
And she helped you practice German.
well, she made it. She sought me out, and I realised how badly I could speak German. Only 2 months after, that was before the end of term in March. End of March. Actually, it was just at the end of March, because that year I think Easter came so early that all the children had Easter eggs sent them. Of course, I didn't, but they shared it with me. And of course, there was a problem in the holidays. There was nowhere for me to go, and the Maltby family, that is the headmaster's family, asked me to go with them to their country house, which was one without electricity. I'd never lived like that before, but it was very interesting, and they were very kind to me. And for a time I stayed there, and then with a friend, a good man friend of my parents, who had already emigrated before, and he put me up for a few days. He lived in North London, yes, actually Paddington, and he took me to where by that time my two sisters had gone on the Kindertransport in February. My little sister was only 3 years old, probably one of the youngest on this transport, and in charge was my sister 8 at the time. And it must have been a terrible time for my parents to send off. But we were lucky. My mother actually came over in July, but my father couldn't get his papers. Meanwhile, my uncle had invited me to spend the summer holiday with them in Holland. And I went there in August on my own, by sea, by train and by sea, without any accompaniment. I was only 10. But the officials were marvellous. And the fact the purser had me sitting beside him until after the last passenger had gone aboard. And I was shown onto the thing, and there again I was looked after overnight. It was a calm voyage, thank goodness. It was a very pleasant journey. In fact, they gave me breakfast in the morning and kept my uncle waiting, which I didn't know. Yes. And I had a marvellous time with them. It was really wonderful. They'd made a lovely little house in Leiden in Holland. My uncle was very happy. They'd become very acclimatized to Holland. Of course, it didn't last, but we didn't know that. And while I was there was a message. My father was coming. He'd been to the office, and each time they'd told him, no, your papers and this and that isn't in order. Come again tomorrow. And one day he expected the same thing, and the man behind the desk said, no, that's okay, you can go. My father didn't go home at all. He just jumped on the train with his coat over his arm, and that's how he arrived in Holland, without anything. And
that was not in the time when you were in Holland.
That was in the time when I was in Holland, and I was on the platform to meet him. And it was a marvellous night that night. But the following morning, two officials, my auntie said, two officials had come early in the morning to say war was about to happen. We must go back to England. I was still going to have a few days with them. This was the end of August, and my school didn't start in the middle of September. So that's what we did. The following morning we took the day trip to the Hook of Holland. We spent overnight in a little tiny room in Paddington, and then in the morning we went to Bosom, near Chichester, where my mother was with my sister, my elder sister. What had happened is that my mother had become a domestic, and as a domestic she was first with one person and then with a family of doctors. This doctor had looked after looked after my little sister when she became ill with ear infection. She found herself in Great Ormond Street Hospital for children, and this doctor had rather compassion and found out more. And eventually my mother became the domestic there, but the little sister had, when she seemed to be on her own, a lovely family, Van Swanenberg, had responded to this doctor and offered to adopt the little sister before my mother came out. And although my mother did come out in July, this same family continued to look to finance the schooling of my little sister until into secondary school.
When you came to England, your father was left in Holland?
No, I went with my father.
Oh.
My father and I went straight back to...
Oh, your father could get into England?
Oh, yes. All the papers were in order at last. We were due to go to America because England really did not want us. But because, although we frequently during the war went to the embassy to try and get to America, there was never any shipping available. So we remained in England throughout the war. After the war, we actually applied for British nationality, which we got in 1949. So then there was no more attempt to go to America. But England was a stop for us until that time in 1949. The other uncle, my father's surviving brother, didn't get out before the outbreak of war, but he managed to get to Iceland, and from there he was on his way to America, but he never got to America. After the war he became the first person to take on Icelandic nationality because Iceland had become independent at the end of the war and no longer Danish. So he became Arnaldur Magnusson instead of Wake. We met him, of course. He came to England and with his wife several times.
Was his wife local
from Iceland? Yes. She was Danish actually. And of course my uncle and his family in Holland were put into a concentration camp in Holland and then transferred to Rasenstadt and eventually to Auschwitz. When they arrived in Auschwitz, my uncle, my aunt and the children, the two younger children, two little fair-haired boys were put to death straight away. The older girl, who was then about 14, was made to work in the munitions factory. No, perhaps she was 45, and she survived. The Russians entered the camp and she was still alive, thank goodness. And she just about survived. And then we saw her in England, and she married a Jewish South African, and went to Israel, fought in the War of Independence, was in the kibbutz, and is now a great-grandmother. And we've been to see her, and she's been here. And it was with her and my two sisters that we went into Leipzig, back to Leipzig for the first time in the year 2000. My sister Renata, when she arrived from the Kindertransport, was taken in by a family. This was due to a friend of my mother's who had been a domestic in this family and persuaded the lady, and she was easily persuaded, to take my sister Renata in. And she looked after her until 1944, when my mother and father managed to get a top floor flat in Croydon, which was empty because of the doodlebugs going overhead. Nobody wanted an upstairs flat. We were all together then, just towards the end of the war. And these people, the Rapsons, were very kind to Renata and looked after her and put her through art school until she was reunited with us. My sister Gabi was in the Wergarth Nursery Training College, and then in another school, all paid for by the Van Zwanenbergs, until she came to us in the top floor flat in Croydon.
So there was a time when all of you were in different places.
All during the war, we were all in different places.
Including your mother and father.
My mother was often in domestic service. My father was in various houses where he had a room. Sometimes I would share it with him. It was Lincoln House in Wimbledon. It was another house in Kew Gardens. That was my first time I went to Kew Gardens then.
And a certain amount of work was he managing to do?
He was first, he had a job which had been promised him from Germany with a book publishing firm, but then he was interned in the Isle of Man, and during that time, my mother and I had accommodation with Mr. Murby's, the controller of the firm. He was 80, and he had a little house, and my mother became a domestic in that house, and I stayed there in the holidays. Unfortunately, during the one air raid, he died of a heart attack, and I found him at the bottom of the stairs in the dark as I came downstairs, and we had a rather horrific night that night. But he was a kindly old man. After that, of course, we had to move again, and at that time my mother stayed with somebody else for a while, and then my mother and father were reunited. My father then, when he came out of the Isle of Man, he then could do demolition work because there was a lot of required. Every night we had air raids, and he used to man a wheelbarrow with Professor so-and-so and Dr. so-and-so, and it wasn't a very good job, but they made the best of it. Eventually, my father had a job in Foyles, the book firm, but he became ill with TB. So for almost a year, he was in a hospital for TB, in a TB ward, and my mother went to visit him. My mother was doing some wool work, clothing wool work, which was essential for the wars, for the army. And Renata was with the family. I was at the school, except during the holidays, and little Gabi was in the Royal Girls Nursery Training College, followed by other schools, and we were never really together until the Doodlebug time in Croydon, and I continued the long journey into Richmond so as not to change school in my last year at school. We were most grateful to all the people who helped us. Without them, it wouldn't have been possible for us to survive. I also met the Reverend W. Simpson through somebody in our current synagogue who befriended him. He had, as a young pastor, he had taken part in the team that brought the Kindertransport children to England. So thanks to him and others. My two sisters were over here. And of course my Mr. Maltby, my school headmaster, I'm most grateful to for 4 years. His son, Dave Maltby, distinguished himself as a dam buster pilot. Unfortunately, a little time later, he was killed in action. They were absolutely devastated at the school, of course. People gave a lot. There was always a wonderful camaraderie. I remember my mother and I having visited my aunt, who had first looked after me, in September, 1 September 1941. And that night, that evening, already before it got dark, the docks were raided. And when we got home, the raids continued because they knew where to bomb. And it took us ages to get home to Kingston, where we lived then. And there was shrapnel and bombs falling all around. We took refuge in a shelter. But enemy aliens, as we were not allowed to be out of the dock. But the warden in the shelter was wonderful. And he said, "Oh, you will stay. You can't leave just now." So we stayed there for an hour or so. And then he said, "Oh, so there's a lull. You can get home." So people were wonderful, really. We found that everywhere. I went to Richmond Grammar School, and I only met one single instance where somebody actively disliked me as a Jew. I had quite some trouble going over many months with this man, with this boy. But I think eventually we made our peace before I left. Because I did talk to him. So it was a lot, very different in England, and we were very proud to be British citizens now. Because I think there's a lot to live up to. And I do hope that in the future, Britain will still be a refuge for people who need it. And I hope people welcome people and also help them to be good citizens.